In the early to mid-1990s, the fighting game genre reigned supreme. With the release and massive subsequent successes of Capcom's Street Fighter II in 1991 and Midway's Mortal Kombat in '92, arcades were making money hand over fist, and everyone seemed to want a piece of the action. Developers came out of the woodwork in an attempt to cash in on the fighting game craze, hoping to come up with the next big game to take arcades by storm and all but guarantee millions of copies sold once it came time to market the inevitable home versions. Then, in 1994, Nintendo and Rare teamed up to throw their hat into the ring with a new game that would offer something a bit different from anything else in the genre, and that game was Killer Instinct. Killer Instinct looked, sounded, and played unlike anything else out there at the time. It was most famous for its unique combo system, which allowed the player to string together a series of hits and special moves automatically with the right button presses, as opposed to having the player key in commands for each individual hit. This unique system allowed arcade goers to put together crazy-looking combos with relative ease. Luckily, you also have the ability to break your opponent's combos by executing a well-timed combo breaker in the middle of the barrage. Each character has a different one, and it's the most important thing to remember when choosing your character, and it's usually just a variation of one of the character's special moves. The game features 11 total selectable characters, including the unlockable end boss, Idol. Each character has their own unique storyline that somehow relates to Ultratech, the mega corporation that ends up being responsible for putting together the Killer Instinct tournament. On top of the combo engine that the game ultimately became famous for, there are also several ways to finish your opponent in Killer Instinct. Taking a cue from Mortal Kombat, each character has at least 2 finishing moves called danger moves that can put your opponent out of commission in a gory, yet for the most part humorous display at the end of a fight. While not nearly as graphic as, say, Mortal Kombat, it was still a surprising addition to the game, especially with Nintendo's name slapped on the marquee. The danger moves weren't the only way to take out an opponent, though, and actually ended up playing second fiddle to the infamous Ultra Combo. The Ultra Combo was a specific button command that could be done in the middle of a combo, but only while your opponent's life bar was flashing red. The result was a huge and flashy combo that would end the fight in an awesome and super dramatic fashion. In addition to the Ultra Combo and the danger move finishes, were also ultimate combos and humiliations, and of course a few stage-related finishers just for good measure. Ultimate combos could be done the same way as an Ultra, except the combo itself would segue into one of your character's finishers. A humiliation could only be done by finishing your opponent while you were still on your first of 2 life bars, and would end up causing your enemy to perform an awkward dance at the end of the fight. The graphics in Killer Instinct looked badass and still hold up extremely well today, even though they were very different from a lot of the other games out there at the time. The characters were all rendered to look 3-dimensional, even though the game itself played strictly on a 2-dimensional plane. The sound was equally great, and one thing that I've always remembered about Killer Instinct was how loud it was. You could hear a KI machine even if it was at the very back of an arcade. So, now that we've talked about the arcade version of Killer Instinct, let's move on to the home versions and discuss some of the history behind them. One of the things most arcade goers remembered about Killer Instinct was the Nintendo advertisement that would play before the title screen for the Ultra 64. According to the arcade game, KI would be available only on Nintendo's Ultra 64 in 1995, which didn't end up happening and disappointed quite a few of us that were hardcore players at the time. As a kid, I'd started saving up for the mythical Ultra 64 immediately, in the hopes of finally getting that awesome home version of Killer Instinct that Nintendo had promised. The rebranded Nintendo 64 didn't end up getting released until 1996, and with no Killer Instinct title to back it up. The only version of the game that we ended up getting was Killer Instinct Gold, which was a stripped-down version of Killer Instinct 2, which we'll talk about later. To this day, KI is the main reason that I never really felt any real attachment to the Nintendo 64. For those of us who were big fans of Killer Instinct, Nintendo let us down right out of the gate with the N64. Nintendo did eventually release a home version of the first game at the tail end of 1995, but it ended up being a downgraded and watered down version on the Super NES in November. Not that it was bad, it wasn't. It was actually pretty damn impressive considering the hardware limitations. All of the characters, stages, combos, and finishers were present and accounted for on the Super Nintendo, although the graphics and sound took an obvious hit during the conversion. The sprites themselves were noticeably smaller than that of the arcade, and the music and sound effects were much more subdued and downsampled. The vast majority of the stages were redesigned as well, and the zooming and panning stages were recreated to take advantage of the Super NES's Mode 7 effect. Also, the full-motion video clips that would play before and after each fight were chopped down into still images, but the game did offer a couple of extra modes to help make up for all the cuts. Another thing worth noting about the Super NES version of Killer Instinct is the awesome packaging. The game was packaged in a cool black cartridge, and even came with a remixed soundtrack disc called Killer Cuts. Killer Instinct was a big game for Nintendo, and they even went on to package a special system bundle that came with a Super NES, a copy of Killer Instinct, and the Killer Cuts CD. As stripped as the Super NES version of Killer Instinct is, it's still a good game and it does play surprisingly well. I've played it so much over the years that even today, whenever I buy a new fighting game, I still have to set my button configuration to the same thing as the default KI setup on the Super Nintendo. In 1996, Rare and Nintendo released Killer Instinct 2 into arcades, and it got a mixed reaction from fans. It was really one of those love it or hate it kind of sequels. A lot was changed for the sequel, and quite a bit was added as well. The combo system from the first game was still the focus of the second, although most of the returning characters' combos and moves were all completely changed around. Super meters were also added, as well as throws and parries, while humiliations and a couple of the first game's characters were removed. This upset quite a few fans of the first game, since players who spent time learning either Chief Thunder, Cinder, or Riptor were completely out of luck with Part 2 and had to start all over again. A couple of new characters were added in with Tusk, Maya, Kim Woo, and Gargos, who would end up replacing Idol as the final boss of Killer Instinct 2. The graphic style was busier, but it didn't seem to look as clean as it did in the first game, and had a grainier kind of look to it. KI2 is one of the few fighting game sequels that I can think of whose graphics were actually not as good as the original. Also later on that year, Nintendo released the previously mentioned Killer Instinct Gold for the Nintendo 64, which ended up being another watered-down KI arcade port. This time, a fair amount of animation was removed from the home version, as well as almost all of the full-motion video. Again, a couple of new modes were added in as compensation, and the stages were re-rendered in 3D. All in all, KI Gold was a pretty decent conversion of a moderately good sequel, even though it had to be played on one of the worst controllers ever made for a fighting game. Killer Instinct is one of my favorite fighting games of all time, and a series that I've always felt was kinda shortchanged. We never did get an arcade-quality port of the first game, even with the advent of the Virtual Console and Xbox Live Marketplace years later. So many franchises these days are getting rebooted and retooled, and not doing something with Killer Instinct would be a crime. We nod and smile with every new Mario game, every new version of Call of Duty or Pokemon or Madden. How about something for us? You know, the ones that have always been big fans and supporters of the series? I can't help but feel like we've just kind of been hung out to dry. Someone over at Rare, Nintendo, or Microsoft needs to get off their asses and do something with this franchise. It's laid dormant for years now and it deserves to be played again. There's a whole new generation of gamers out there today who haven't yet had the opportunity to ultra combo the living hell out of someone. And that's just not right. As always, guys, thank you for watching and subscribing. And until next time, stay classic.
Oh,